The smell of death hit Mrs. Alice the moment she opened the door, a nauseating mixture of human waste and despair that made her stumble backward. But it was the sight that would haunt her forever. Slumped in his wheelchair like a broken marionette, Walter Hayes sat motionless, his once robust 200-pound frame now a skeletal 158 pounds, clothes hanging like rags on jutting bones. For 21 days, this 71-year-old man had been left to die, abandoned by his beautiful young wife and the stepbrother he'd raised like a son, who were at that very moment sipping cocktails on a Jamaican beach. Spending his money while he slowly starved just feet away from a refrigerator full of food he couldn't reach. This is the story of the most shocking betrayal you'll ever hear, where love became a death sentence and family became the enemy. At 71 years old, Walter Hayes had spent his entire existence pouring love into others. Decades of devotion, countless sacrifices, endless generosity. This man had built his life around caring for everyone who mattered to him. But in one catastrophic moment, everything shattered. A devastating stroke left Walter completely helpless, his body betraying him, leaving him entirely dependent on his stunning 30-year-old wife, Destiny. She was meant to be his guardian angel, his lifeline in the darkness. But Destiny was living a double life. When Walter's troubled 27-year-old stepbrother Dennis came to stay, something sinister began to unfold. Destiny and Dennis weren't just providing care, they were plotting destruction, using drugs together, draining his accounts, all while Walter lay helpless, watching his world crumble. Then came the confrontation. When Walter caught them, instead of shame, they looked at him with pure contempt. And that's when they did the unthinkable. They packed their bags, took his money, and left for Jamaica. They abandoned him, paralyzed, immobile, unable to cry for help, unable to nourish himself. For 21 days, Walter Hayes was left to perish in solitude. What unfolded next will leave you speechless. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. What would you have done in Walter's position? Walter Hayes was 71 years old when his universe imploded. But to truly grasp the magnitude of this betrayal, you must understand who Walter was before tragedy struck. He was a man who had devoted his entire existence to providing for others, to being the foundation everyone could depend upon. Walter had labored for 47 years as a construction supervisor. Through scorching heat and bitter cold, torrential rain and blazing sunshine, Walter was consistently the first to arrive at the worksite and the last to depart. His hands bore the scars and calluses of decades of manual labor. Yet those same hands had constructed homes for countless families, had provided prosperity for his loved ones, and had never once been raised in violence. But Walter's compassion extended far beyond merely supporting his family. He was the type of man who would travel across the city at 2 a.m. to assist a colleague whose vehicle had broken down. When his neighbor Mrs. Patterson struggled with mortgage payments after losing her husband, Walter quietly covered them for 4 months until she regained stability. He never requested repayment, and he never mentioned his generosity to anyone. During holiday seasons, Walter would anonymously contribute toys to the local orphanage. Throughout summers, he would employ neighborhood teenagers for small projects around his property, compensating them far beyond what the work merited because he understood they needed the income. When his congregation required a new sanctuary roof, Walter organized the entire volunteer effort and donated his labor every weekend for 3 months. Walter had been married to his first wife, Dorothy, for 41 years before she succumbed to cancer. Dorothy was his soulmate, his high school sweetheart, the mother of his children. When she received a stage 4 pancreatic cancer diagnosis, Walter took early retirement to become her full-time caregiver. For 20 months, he served as her nurse, her companion, her strength. He mastered administering injections, managing her prescriptions, and assisting her with bathing when she became too frail to manage alone. He never complained, never displayed his terror or frustration in her presence. At night, after Dorothy fell asleep, Walter would sometimes sit in his pickup truck in the driveway and weep, pleading with God to take him instead of her. But during daylight hours, he was her anchor, her protector, the man who ensured she felt cherished every moment until she drew her final breath. When Dorothy died 6 years ago, Walter believed his heart would never mend. The house felt hollow without her laughter, the bed felt frigid without her warmth, and Walter wondered if he would spend his remaining years in solitude. But even in his grief, he continued helping others. He volunteered at the hospice where Dorothy had spent her last days, sitting with patients who had no family, reading to them, holding their hands, ensuring no one died alone as he feared he might. Walter had 3 children from his first marriage. His daughters, Rebecca and Jennifer, both resided out of state with families of their own. They maintained regular contact and visited when possible, but their lives were occupied with their own children and careers. Walter never complained about the distance. He had raised them to be independent and strong, and he took pride in the women they had become. Then there was Dennis, Walter's stepbrother, who had come into his life when Walter was 12 and Dennis was just 4 years old. Walter's father had remarried after his mother's death, and suddenly Walter found himself with a little brother who looked up to him with absolute adoration. From the beginning, Walter had treated Dennis like his own son rather than just a stepbrother. Dennis had always been different from Walter's daughters. Where Rebecca and Jennifer were responsible and ambitious, Dennis was reckless and aimless. Even as a child, Dennis had struggled with authority and had difficulty following rules. As he matured, those tendencies had only intensified. Despite the lack of blood relation, Walter had always felt a deep responsibility for Dennis. When their parents died in a car accident when Dennis was 16, Walter became his legal guardian and raised him as his own son. Walter was only 24 at the time, just starting his career, but he never hesitated to take on the responsibility. Dennis had abandoned college after 18 months, much to Walter's devastation. Walter had worked overtime for months to accumulate money for Dennis's education, sacrificing his own comfort and even securing a second mortgage on the house. When Dennis quit school to discover himself, Walter felt like those sacrifices had been meaningless. Dennis drifted from job to job, never remaining anywhere long enough to build a career or save any money. He had become involved with drugs, initially marijuana, then harder substances that Walter didn't want to contemplate. Dennis had been arrested twice for possession, and both times, Walter had depleted his savings account to hire the best attorney he could afford. The first time Dennis was arrested, Walter sat in the courtroom and watched his stepbrother plead guilty to drug possession. After the hearing, Dennis promised Walter that he had learned his lesson, that he would get clean and make something of his life. Walter wanted to believe him so desperately that he ignored all the warning signs that Dennis was lying. The second arrest came 3 years later. This time, Dennis had been caught with enough drugs to face felony charges. Walter mortgaged his house again to pay for Dennis's defense, and he spent every penny of his retirement savings to get his stepbrother into a private rehabilitation facility. Dennis completed the program and seemed genuinely committed to sobriety, but within 8 months, he was using again. Despite everything, Walter loved Dennis deeply. He kept hoping that Dennis would mature, that he would find his way and become the man Walter knew he could be. Every time Dennis called asking for money, Walter would lecture him about responsibility, but he would always send the check. Every time Dennis promised to get clean and get his life together, Walter believed him, even when everyone else had given up hope. "You're enabling him," Dorothy had told Walter during one of their last conversations before she died. "You're not helping him by giving him money every time he asks." "He's like my son," Walter had replied. "I raised him from the time he was 4. I can't just abandon him." "There's a difference between abandoning him and setting boundaries," Dorothy had said gently. "Sometimes love means saying no." But Walter couldn't bring himself to say no to Dennis. In his mind, giving up on his stepbrother would be giving up on everything he believed about family and loyalty and unconditional love. He would rather sacrifice everything he had than risk losing Dennis forever. For years after Dorothy's death, when Walter was 68 and feeling the weight of his loneliness, he met Destiny Williams at a coffee shop downtown. She was working as a barista, and something about her radiant smile and warm personality caught his attention. Destiny was 27 years old, beautiful in a way that made men stop and stare, with long auburn hair and blue eyes that sparkled when she laughed. When Destiny smiled at Walter and asked about his day, it was the first time in years that anyone had shown genuine interest in his well-being. She remembered his name after just 2 visits, and she always asked about his work and how he was doing. For a man who had spent 4 years feeling invisible and forgotten, Destiny's attention was like sunshine after a long winter. Walter knew the age difference was significant, but Destiny didn't seem to mind. She was kind to him, interested in his stories about his work and his late wife. She told him about her own struggles, about growing up in foster care, about moving from home to home until she aged out of the system at 18. She talked about her dreams of having a real family someday, of finding someone who would love her unconditionally and never leave her. "I've never had that," She told Walter one evening when he was driving her home from work because her car had broken down. "I've never had someone who really cared about me, who I could count on no matter what." Walter's heart ached for this beautiful young woman who had never experienced the kind of love he had taken for granted with Dorothy. When he asked her out, she said yes without hesitation, tears in her eyes as she told him that no one had ever treated her with such respect and kindness. Their courtship was sweet and old-fashioned. Walter took her to elegant restaurants, bought her flowers, and treated her with the respect and tenderness that he had always shown Dorothy. He opened doors for her, pulled out her chair, and listened intently when she spoke. Destiny seemed to appreciate his gentlemanly ways, often commenting that men her own age didn't know how to treat a woman properly. "You make me feel secure," she told him after they had been dating for 4 months. "You make me feel like I matter." Walter fell in love with Destiny's vulnerability, her gratitude for simple kindnesses, her apparent desire to build the stable, loving family she had never had. He loved that he could provide for her, protect her, give her the security that had been missing from her life. It made him feel young and vital again, gave him a sense of purpose that he had lost when Dorothy died. After 14 months of dating, Walter proposed. He knew it might seem rushed to some people, but at his age, he didn't see the point in waiting. Life was short, and he had already lost too many years to loneliness. Destiny accepted eagerly, telling him that she had never felt so loved and secure in her life. "I promise I'll take care of you forever," she said through happy tears. "I'll never leave you, no matter what happens. You've saved me, Walter. You've given me everything I ever wanted." They were married in a small ceremony at the local church, with Rebecca and Jennifer serving as bridesmaids and a few close friends in attendance. Dennis was supposed to walk Walter down the aisle, but he failed to show up, claiming later that he had forgotten about the wedding. Walter was hurt, but he tried not to let Dennis's absence dampen what should have been one of the happiest days of his life. For the first 18 months of their marriage, Walter felt like the luckiest man alive. Destiny brought youth and energy into his life. She redecorated their home, filled it with music and laughter, and made Walter feel young again. She was affectionate and attentive, always asking about his day, rubbing his shoulders when he came home sore from work, and making him feel appreciated and loved. Walter was happy to provide for her, to give her the security and love she had never had growing up. He bought her clothes, jewelry, a new car, anything that would make her smile. He opened a joint bank account and gave her access to his credit cards, wanting her to feel like a true partner in their marriage. "Buy whatever makes you happy," he would tell her. "I've been saving money my whole life. What's the point of having it if I can't spoil the woman I love?" Destiny seemed genuinely happy too. She would cook Walter's favorite meals, surprise him with little gifts, and curl up next to him in the evenings to watch television. She called him her hero, her provider, her everything. She made him feel needed and appreciated in a way he hadn't felt since Dorothy died. But there were small signs, things that Walter noticed but dismissed at the time. Destiny was always interested in their finances, asking detailed questions about his pension, his savings, his life insurance policies. She encouraged him to retire early, telling him they could live comfortably on his pension and savings while they were still young enough to enjoy life together. Sometimes Walter would catch her looking through his mail or his financial statements, but when he asked about it, she would say she was just trying to help him organize his paperwork. When expensive items appeared in their house, a new television, expensive jewelry, designer handbags, Destiny would claim they were gifts from friends or that she had gotten them on sale. Walter began thinking about retirement. He had saved diligently over the years and had a good pension from his union job. He and Destiny talked about traveling, about all the places they would visit together once he stopped working. They talked about maybe buying a small house by the lake, about spending their golden years fishing and relaxing and enjoying each other's company. Walter thought he had found his happily ever after. He thought he had found someone who would love him and stand by him for the rest of his life, someone who truly appreciated everything he had worked for and was willing to share it with. He had no idea that everything was about to change, or that the woman sleeping peacefully beside him was already planning for a very different future than the one they discussed together. It happened on a Thursday morning in April. Walter was getting ready for work, standing in the bathroom shaving, when suddenly the room started spinning. The razor fell from his hand as a crushing pain exploded in his head. His left leg gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing as the massive stroke ravaged his brain. Destiny found him 25 minutes later and immediately called 911. The paramedics rushed Walter to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. When he finally regained consciousness 4 days later, Walter discovered that his world had been turned upside down. The stroke had left him completely paralyzed on his left side. He couldn't move his left arm or leg, couldn't walk, and needed a wheelchair to get around. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand, though his mind remained sharp. Simple tasks that he had taken for granted his entire life, eating, bathing, using the bathroom, now required assistance. The doctors explained that Walter would need extensive rehabilitation, but they couldn't promise that he would ever regain full function. They said his recovery would depend largely on his determination and the support he received at home. Destiny assured them that Walter would have all the support he needed. "I'm going to take care of you," she told Walter, holding his hand as he lay in the hospital bed. "We're going to get through this together. I'm not going anywhere." Walter believed her. He had to believe her. The alternative, that the woman he loved might abandon him in his time of greatest need, was too terrible to consider. The first few months after Walter came home from the hospital were the hardest of his life. Everything was a struggle. He had to learn how to transfer from his bed to his wheelchair, how to navigate their home in his new condition, how to ask for help with dignity when he needed to use the bathroom or take a shower. Destiny seemed to handle the transition well at first. She learned how to help him with his physical therapy exercises, drove him to his medical appointments, and patiently assisted him with daily tasks. She was gentle when he struggled to communicate, taking time to understand what he was trying to say even when it took several attempts. But as the weeks turned into months, Walter began to notice changes in Destiny's behavior. She became more impatient with his needs, more frustrated when he couldn't do something quickly enough or when he needed help with tasks she found unpleasant. She started making comments about how difficult their life had become, how different things were from what she had expected when they got married. "This isn't what I signed up for," she said one evening after helping him shower, a task that had taken longer than usual because Walter was having a particularly difficult day with his coordination. Walter felt a stab of pain in his chest that had nothing to do with his medical condition. "I know this is hard," he managed to say, his words slow and careful. "I'm sorry this happened to us." "Sorry doesn't change anything," Destiny replied, and there was a coldness in her voice that Walter had never heard before. "Sorry doesn't make any of this easier." The tension in their house began to build. Destiny started going out more often, claiming she needed time away from the stress of caregiving. She would leave Walter alone for hours at a time, sometimes forgetting to prepare his meals or help him with his medications before she left. When he asked where she had been, she would become defensive and accuse him of not trusting her. Walter tried to be understanding. He knew that being his caregiver was exhausting and that Destiny had given up a lot to take care of him. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. The woman who had once looked at him with love and admiration now looked at him with something that resembled resentment. 8 months after Walter's stroke, Dennis showed up at their door. He was carrying a dirty duffel bag and looked like he had been living on the streets. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair was unwashed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and poor choices. "I need a place to stay," Dennis told Destiny when she answered the door. "Just temporarily, until I can get back on my feet." Destiny looked uncertain. She glanced back at Walter, who was sitting in his wheelchair in the living room, then back at Dennis. "I don't know. Things are really complicated right now with Walter's condition." "Please," Dennis said, and there was desperation in his voice. "I've got nowhere else to go. I lost my apartment, lost my job. I just need some time to figure things out." Walter had been listening to the conversation from his wheelchair. Despite everything that had happened between them over the years, Dennis was like a son to him. And despite his disappointment in the choices Dennis had made, Walter couldn't bear the thought of his stepbrother being homeless. "Let him stay," Walter called out, his words slurred but understandable. Destiny sighed, but stepped aside to let Dennis into the house. "Fine, but this is temporary. You need to get a job and find your own place as soon as possible." Dennis nodded eagerly. "Of course. Thank you, both of you. I really appreciate this." At first, having Dennis in the house seemed like it might be a good thing. He occasionally helped with household chores and sometimes sat with Walter to watch television or play cards. Walter was grateful for the company and hopeful that this might be an opportunity for him and his stepbrother to repair their relationship. But it quickly became clear that Dennis hadn't changed. He slept until noon every day, then spent his afternoons playing video games or watching TV. In the evenings, he would disappear, coming home late smelling like marijuana and alcohol. When Walter asked him about his job search, Dennis would mumble vague responses about putting out applications and waiting to hear back. More troubling, Walter began to notice that money was disappearing from his wallet. Small amounts at first, $20 or $30, but it was happening regularly. When he mentioned it to Destiny, she suggested that maybe he was confused about how much money he had, that his stroke might have affected his memory. But Walter's mind was clear, and he knew someone was stealing from him. Then there was the matter of Dennis and Destiny's relationship. Walter couldn't help but notice that they were spending a lot of time together, often whispering and laughing about things they didn't share with him. They would sit close together on the couch while watching TV, and sometimes Walter would catch them looking at each other in ways that made him uncomfortable. He tried to dismiss his suspicions as paranoia, telling himself that he was just feeling insecure because of his condition. But deep down, something didn't feel right about the dynamic between his wife and his stepbrother. The truth came out on a cold January morning when Walter woke up early, around 5:30, needing to use the bathroom. Destiny was still asleep beside him, and he didn't want to wake her by asking for help. He had been working on becoming more independent with his transfers, and while it was difficult, he was getting better at moving from the bed to his wheelchair on his own. He managed to get into his wheelchair and began making his way slowly down the hallway toward the bathroom. As he passed Dennis's room, he heard voices and caught a strong smell of marijuana smoke. The door was slightly open, and without thinking, Walter glanced inside. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. Dennis and Destiny were sitting on the bed together, sharing a marijuana joint. Destiny was wearing only a t-shirt and underwear, and she was sitting far too close to Dennis for any appropriate sister-in-law and brother-in-law relationship. As Walter watched in horror, Dennis leaned over and kissed Destiny on the mouth. Not a quick, innocent kiss, but a deep, passionate embrace that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Walter's hands began to shake, and he gripped the wheels of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to burst into the room and confront them, but he was afraid that in his emotional state, he might lose control of his wheelchair or his voice. Instead, he continued to the bathroom, his mind reeling with what he had just witnessed. His wife, the woman he had married, provided for, and trusted completely, was having an affair with his stepbrother, the man he had raised like a son. The betrayal was so deep, so unthinkable, that Walter could barely process it. He sat in the bathroom for nearly an hour, trying to decide what to do. When he finally returned to the bedroom, Destiny was back in bed, pretending to be asleep. Walter lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how his life had come to this point. The next morning, while Destiny was helping him eat breakfast, Walter decided he had to confront the situation. "I know what's going on between you and Dennis," he said quietly. Destiny's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "What are you talking about?" "I saw you last night. In his room. I saw you kissing him." For a moment, Destiny looked like she might deny it. Her face went pale, then flushed red. But then her expression hardened, and Walter saw something in her eyes that terrified him, cold contempt. "So what if you did?" she said, setting down the spoon with deliberate force. "What are you going to do about it?" The casual cruelty of her response hit Walter like a physical blow. He had expected tears, apologies, shame, anything but this cold defiance. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How could you do this to us? To our marriage?" Destiny laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Marriage? What marriage? You're not a husband anymore, Walter. You're a burden. You're a sick old man who can't even feed himself." The words cut deeper than any physical pain Walter had ever experienced. "I didn't choose this. I didn't ask to have a stroke. And I didn't choose to be trapped taking care of an invalid," Destiny shot back. "Do you have any idea what my life has been like for the past 8 months? I'm 30 years old, Walter. I should be out living my life, not stuck in this house changing your diapers and watching you drool on yourself." Dennis appeared in the doorway, apparently drawn by the sound of their argument. He looked uncomfortable but not particularly ashamed. "Walter, maybe you should try to understand," Dennis said. "Destiny and I, we connect. We make each other happy. And honestly, it's not like you can be a real husband to her anymore." Walter stared at his stepbrother in disbelief. This was the child he had raised from age 4, supported, bailed out of jail, and welcomed back into his home despite everything. And this was how Dennis repaid him. She's my wife, Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're like my son. What you're doing is wrong. Wrong according to who? Dennis asked. You? Look at yourself, Walter. You're not exactly in a position to make demands. The cruelty of that statement took Walter's breath away. In that moment, he realized that he had lost not just his mobility and independence, but also the respect and love of the two people he cared about most. I want both of you out of my house, Walter said. Destiny and Dennis exchanged glances, and then Destiny smiled. A cold, calculating smile that chilled Walter to the bone. Your house? She said. I'm your wife, remember? This is my house too, and I'm not going anywhere. What happened after Walter discovered their affair was worse than anything he could have imagined. Instead of being ashamed or trying to hide their relationship, Destiny and Dennis became blatant about it. They would kiss and touch each other right in front of Walter, as if he were invisible. They would disappear into Dennis's room for hours at a time, leaving Walter alone and unable to care for himself. The financial abuse escalated as well. Destiny took control of Walter's bank accounts and credit cards, claiming that as his wife, she had every right to manage their finances. She and Dennis went on shopping sprees, buying expensive clothes, electronics, and jewelry with Walter's money. They took his car whenever they wanted, often disappearing for days without explanation. But the worst part was the neglect. Destiny began treating Walter like a burden to be endured rather than a husband to be cared for. She would leave him in bed for hours without helping him to the bathroom, forcing him to soil himself. She would forget to give him his medications or help him eat. Sometimes she would leave him alone in the house for entire days, claiming she had errands to run. When Walter protested or asked for help, Destiny would become angry and abusive. You're lucky I don't put you in a nursing home, she would say. You're lucky I'm willing to put up with you at all. Dennis was no better. He treated Walter with casual cruelty, making jokes about his condition and openly mocking him in front of Destiny. At least when you die, we won't have to pretend anymore, he said one day, referring to himself and Destiny as we, in a way that made Walter's stomach turn. Walter tried to call his daughters for help, but Destiny had hidden his phone, claiming he was too confused to use it properly. When Rebecca and Jennifer called the house, Destiny would tell them that Walter was doing well and didn't need anything. She painted a picture of devoted caregiving that was the complete opposite of reality. Walter felt like a prisoner in his own home. He was trapped in a body that wouldn't obey him, dependent on people who despised him, and unable to escape or ask for help. He began to pray for death, hoping that God would take him home before things got any worse. Then, just before Christmas, Destiny and Dennis announced they were planning a vacation. Dennis and I are going to Jamaica for the holidays, Destiny announced one December morning while reluctantly helping Walter with his breakfast. We need some time away from all this stress. Walter nearly choked on his oatmeal. What about me? Who's going to take care of me while you're gone? You'll be fine, Destiny said dismissively. It's only for a week. You can manage on your own for a week. But Walter knew he couldn't manage on his own for even a day, let alone a week. He couldn't cook, couldn't bathe himself, couldn't even get to the bathroom reliably without help. The thought of being left alone was terrifying. Please don't go, he begged. Or at least arrange for someone to come help me. A nurse, or one of the girls from the home health agency. Do you have any idea how much that costs? Destiny snapped. We can't afford to waste money on that when you're perfectly capable of taking care of yourself for a few days. I'm not capable, Walter said desperately. You know I can't do this alone. Please, I'm begging you. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Destiny and Dennis were determined to take their vacation, and they didn't care what happened to Walter while they were gone. As their departure date approached, Walter became more and more panicked. He tried everything he could think of to change their minds. He offered to pay for them to take a more expensive trip if they would just arrange for someone to care for him. He promised to give them access to more of his money if they would just not abandon him. Nothing worked. If anything, his desperation seemed to amuse them. On December 18th, Destiny and Dennis packed their bags and prepared to leave. Walter watched from his wheelchair as they loaded suitcases into his car, the car they were taking without permission, using money they had stolen from him. We'll be back after New Year's, Destiny said as she grabbed her purse. Try not to cause any trouble while we're gone. 3 weeks, Walter said in shock. You said a week. Plans change, Dennis said with a shrug. We decided to extend our stay. Jamaica is expensive, so we might as well make the most of it. Walter realized with growing horror that they were planning to spend 3 weeks living it up in Jamaica while he was trapped alone in his house, unable to care for himself. "Please don't do this," he said one last time. "Please don't leave me alone." But they were already walking out the door, laughing and talking about their upcoming trip as if Walter didn't exist. The door slammed shut, and Walter was alone. The first day wasn't too bad. Walter managed to will himself to the kitchen and grab some crackers and a bottle of water from the counter. He rationed them carefully, knowing he had to make them last. He also positioned himself near the downstairs bathroom, though getting in and out was a struggle that left him exhausted. By the second day, Walter was already in trouble. He had finished the crackers and water, and he couldn't reach anything else to eat or drink. The refrigerator and pantry might as well have been on another planet. He tried to will himself outside to get help from the neighbors, but his wheelchair couldn't navigate the front steps. By the third day, Walter was becoming weak and disoriented. He had managed to get some water from the bathroom faucet by using a cup he found on the sink, but he hadn't eaten anything in over 24 hours. His blood sugar was dropping, and he was starting to feel dizzy and confused. As the days stretched on, Walter's condition deteriorated rapidly. He was losing weight, becoming dehydrated, and developing pressure sores from sitting in his wheelchair for days at a time. He had soiled himself multiple times and couldn't clean himself properly, leading to painful skin infections. Walter tried desperately to reach his phone, which Destiny had left on the kitchen counter, probably intentionally, knowing he couldn't get to it. He made countless attempts to wheel himself close enough to grab it, but each time his weakness would overcome him and he would nearly fall from his chair. By the second week, Walter was fading in and out of consciousness. He was severely malnourished and dehydrated, and his body was beginning to shut down. He spent most of his time slumped in his wheelchair, dreaming of his late wife Dorothy and praying for either rescue or a peaceful death. During the third week, Walter barely had the strength to keep his eyes open. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing was labored, and he had lost so much weight that his clothes hung loose on his frail frame. He was dying slowly, abandoned by the people who should have loved him most. It was on January 10th, after 21 days alone, that salvation finally came in the form of Mrs. Alice, his 62-year-old neighbor. Mrs. Alice had lived next door to Walter for 12 years. She was a retired librarian who had always been friendly with Walter and Dorothy, and she had expressed her condolences when Dorothy passed away. After Walter's stroke, she had occasionally stopped by to check on him, though Destiny usually turned her away, saying Walter was resting or doing therapy. Mrs. Alice had noticed that she hadn't seen any activity at Walter's house in weeks. The newspapers were piling up on the driveway, the car was gone, and the house looked dark and empty. She was beginning to worry that something was wrong. On January 10th, Mrs. Alice decided to investigate. She walked over and knocked on the front door, calling out Walter's name. When no one answered, she tried the doorbell and knocked louder. Still nothing. Growing more concerned, Mrs. Alice walked around to the back of the house and looked through the sliding glass door. What she saw made her gasp in horror. Walter was slumped unconscious in his wheelchair in the middle of the living room. He was drastically thin, his clothes were filthy, and it was obvious that something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Alice immediately called 911, then used the spare key that Walter had given her years earlier to enter the house. The smell hit her as soon as she opened the door, the smell of human waste, illness, and neglect. She rushed to Walter's side and tried to wake him. His pulse was weak and rapid, his breathing was shallow, and his skin felt hot and dry to the touch. Mrs. Alice, who had basic first aid training, recognized the signs of severe dehydration and starvation. The paramedics arrived within minutes and immediately began working to stabilize Walter. They started in 4 to get fluids into his system, checked his vital signs, and prepared him for transport to the hospital. One of the paramedics radioed ahead to the emergency room. "We have a 71-year-old male, stroke victim, showing signs of severe neglect and possible abandonment. Patient is in critical condition." Mrs. Alice rode in the ambulance with Walter, holding his hand and telling him that everything was going to be okay, that he was safe now. She wasn't sure if he could hear her, but she hoped that somewhere in his unconscious mind, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. At the hospital, doctors fought to save Walter's life. He was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from multiple infections. His kidneys were failing, and his body was in shock from the prolonged neglect. For several hours, it was unclear whether he would survive. But Walter was tougher than anyone had given him credit for. Slowly, gradually, he began to respond to treatment. After 4 days in intensive care, he regained consciousness. The first person he saw was Mrs. Alice, who had been maintaining a vigil by his bedside. "Thank you," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for saving my life." "I'm so sorry I didn't check sooner," Mrs. Alice said, squeezing his hand gently. "I had no idea what was happening to you." As Walter recovered, the full extent of his ordeal became clear. He had lost 42 pounds during his 3 weeks alone. He had severe pressure sores, multiple infections, and kidney damage that might be permanent. The doctors said that if Mrs. Alice hadn't found him when she did, he would have died within days. Mrs. Alice had immediately contacted Adult Protective Services, who launched an investigation. When they saw the condition of Walter's house and learned about his hospitalization, they contacted the police. Destiny and Dennis returned from Jamaica on January 12th, 4 days after Walter had been hospitalized. They had extended their vacation even further, using Walter's credit cards to live in luxury while he was fighting for his life. They arrived at the house expecting to find Walter exactly where they had left him, weak and helpless, but alive. Instead, they found police cars in the driveway and investigators waiting inside. The lead investigator was a veteran officer who specialized in crimes against vulnerable adults. She had seen many terrible cases over the years, but Walter's situation was particularly shocking because of the family relationships involved. When Destiny and Dennis walked into the house and saw the police, they immediately began making excuses. Destiny claimed she had arranged for a home health aide to check on Walter, but the aide had apparently failed to show up. Dennis claimed he thought Destiny was handling Walter's care and had no idea Walter had been left alone. But the evidence told a different story. Financial records showed that Destiny and Dennis had spent over $18,000 of Walter's money during their Jamaica trip. Bank surveillance footage showed them withdrawing large amounts of cash from Walter's accounts. Cell phone records proved that neither of them had made any calls to check on Walter or arrange for his care. Most damning of all, security footage from a neighbor's camera showed Destiny and Dennis leaving the house on December 18th, loading expensive luggage into Walter's car while laughing and joking as if they didn't have a care in the world. Destiny and Dennis were arrested on the spot and charged with aggravated abuse of a vulnerable adult, financial exploitation of an elderly person, and theft. The prosecutor called it one of the most callous cases of elder abuse she had ever seen. The trial began 8 months later. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated cruelty and greed. They showed evidence of the affair between Destiny and Dennis, documented the systematic financial abuse, and presented medical testimony about Walter's condition when he was found. Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician who had treated Walter, testified that she had never seen such severe neglect in her 20 years of practice. Mr. Hayes was literally dying when he arrived at the hospital, she said. His body was shutting down from starvation and dehydration. If he had been found even a day later, he would not have survived. Mrs. Alice's testimony was particularly powerful. She described finding Walter unconscious and near death, and her voice broke as she talked about the condition of the house and the obvious signs of prolonged neglect. The defense tried to argue that Destiny and Dennis had believed Walter could care for himself, but their arguments fell apart under scrutiny. Bank records showed they had been spending Walter's money lavishly while he was alone and dying. Photos from their social media accounts showed them living it up in Jamaica, posting pictures of expensive meals and resort activities while Walter was fighting for his life. The most devastating testimony came from Walter himself. Despite his speech difficulties, he was able to tell his story clearly and powerfully. He described the affair, the abuse, the abandonment, and the 3 weeks of hell he had endured. "They left me to die," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "My wife and the man I raised like a son left me to die, so they could go on vacation with my money." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Destiny was sentenced to 20 years in prison for aggravated abuse of a vulnerable adult, financial exploitation, and theft. The judge called her actions a profound betrayal of the most fundamental duties of marriage and human decency. Dennis received 15 years for his role in the abuse and theft. The judge noted that while Dennis was not Walter's primary caregiver, his participation in the affair and financial crimes, combined with his abandonment of the man who had raised him, warranted significant punishment. Both defendants would be required to pay full restitution to Walter for the money they had stolen, though the prosecutor acknowledged that Walter would likely never see most of it returned. As the sentences were read, Destiny showed no emotion, staring straight ahead with the same cold expression she had worn throughout the trial. Dennis broke down crying, claiming he was sorry and that he had never meant for things to go so far. But his tears came too late. After the trial, Walter faced the challenge of rebuilding his life. The physical damage from his 3 weeks of neglect had taken a permanent toll on his health. His kidney function never fully recovered, and he required ongoing medical care for the infections and pressure sores he had developed. But perhaps more challenging than the physical damage was the emotional trauma. Walter had to come to terms with the fact that the two people he had loved most in the world had been willing to let him die for money. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain he had ever experienced. Rebecca and Jennifer began visiting more frequently, taking turns coming to stay with Walter for long weekends. They helped him redecorate the house, removing all traces of Destiny and Dennis and making it feel like home again. They also encouraged him to pursue hobbies he had enjoyed before his stroke, like woodworking and reading. Mrs. Alice became more than just a neighbor. She became Walter's closest friend and advocate. She checked on him daily, helped with grocery shopping and appointments, and provided the companionship that helped him heal emotionally as well as physically. Slowly, Walter began to rebuild his life. He started speaking at elder abuse prevention seminars, sharing his story to help others recognize the warning signs of financial and physical abuse. His powerful testimony helped pass new legislation strengthening protections for vulnerable adults. "I survived because one person cared enough to check on me," Walter would tell audiences. "Mrs. Alice saved my life simply by paying attention and taking action when something seemed wrong." Walter's story reminds us that families aren't always defined by blood, that trust must be earned and can be lost, and that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we least expect. But it also reminds us that kindness still exists in the world, that strangers can become saviors, and that it's possible to rebuild a meaningful life even after experiencing the unthinkable. If you know an elderly person who seems isolated or whose caregiver seems suspicious, don't hesitate to reach out. A simple phone call, a wellness check, or a conversation with authorities could save a life. As Walter often says in his speeches, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Elder abuse affects millions of seniors every year, but with awareness, vigilance, and compassion, we can protect our most vulnerable citizens and ensure that no one has to endure what Walter Hayes survived. What would you have done if you were in Walter's situation? How can we better protect the elderly in our communities? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that matter. Remember, if you see something, say something. It could save a life.